Today, I'm joined by Bruce Cozad, co-founder and former CEO of Jazz Pharmaceuticals.
It's okay to bet the company. You can say to your board and your investors, let's bet the company on this decision, but you ought to know you're betting the company.
Talk about the name and where it came about.
When you think of a jazz musician, you tend to think of somebody who's a master of their instrument, right? But jazz is always played together. You know, we survey our employees on a regular basis and ask them, is the culture we're describing the culture you're experiencing? In a period of uncertainty, even though the communication may be hard, you probably need to do more, not less communication. You've got to make sure people can trust you.
Today's guest has never shied away from complexity or controversy. But more often than not, that's exactly where he's found value. Today, I'm joined by Bruce Cozad, co-founder and former CEO of Jazz Pharmaceuticals. Over 2+ decades, Bruce built Jazz from a company with no product and no pipeline into a global biopharma leader. Early on, Jazz's cornerstone product, Xyrem, was a drug for narcolepsy with a highly complex distribution model. Many companies would have avoided it, but Bruce leaned in because he saw a medicine that could meaningfully change patients' lives. That willingness to embrace complexity became a defining advantage. That same mindset showed up years later in one of the most debated decisions in the company's history, the $7 billion acquisition of GW Pharmaceuticals. While others focused on the controversy around the lead product, Bruce saw something bigger, a durable platform, a pipeline with long-term potential, and a culture that closely matched Jazz. In this conversation, we talk about building a company around culture from day one, making strategic decisions that don't always look obvious in the moment, and why complexity, when grounded in purpose, can be a strength. We also get into capital allocation, the near-death experience during the financial crisis, what it taught him about leadership under pressure, and why, in the hardest moments, patients have to be your North Star. This is a conversation about conviction, culture, and building something that lasts. No Spotlight Needed is proud to welcome Bruce Cozad. Bruce, it's so good to see you. I'm really excited. I think this is going to be a really fun conversation. I couldn't think of anybody better to start off season 2. So thank you for being here.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So I definitely want to get into some history. But before we do, I wanted to ask just about Jazz. You know, there's always been speculation that Jazz should be acquired, could have been acquired, maybe it was a target of acquired. But I was also told that you built Jazz to be a forever company, that the point was never to actually sell the company. Is that true? And can you tell me a little bit of history about why that was?
Yeah, so forever seems like a long time. But I definitely felt like the best strategy, honestly, whether you wanted to sell a company or not, is to build a company that's got a bright future itself, that's not dependent on a transaction, that has the right capabilities, that has the right financial wherewithal, that's got the right management, the right strategy. You know, we're a publicly traded company. Anyone can buy a share of Jazz, and if you paid enough, you could buy all the shares of Jazz.
Right.
You know, that's part and parcel of being a public company. I've always wanted to believe that the board of directors, given an offer to buy the company, might believe that continuing to operate the company could produce superior value for shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
You know, both, again, the right strategy, the right portfolio of commercial products and R&D programs, and the confidence that that management team can execute on that plan to realize the value. So, you know, we're a public company, so I'm not going to go into
right.
if we've been approached, when we've been approached, or for how much. But I believe for all companies, the best strategy is to know you can create value yourself. And then if somebody comes along with a superior offer to that, you know, we know what happens in our industry.
Yeah. I mean, you did tell me early on, though, that you did create Jazz with a specific culture in mind.
For sure.
And that it was not about a compound, but it was about a culture. Can you actually describe that culture? Do you have words to describe what you've created over the last 20 plus years?
I will say I know what the culture feels like. I'll try to articulate it, but I think my employees know what that culture is. It's one reason people join the company.
Mm-hmm.
It's a strong reason people stay with the company. And it's even a reason that some of our former employees come back to the company, so-called boomerangers,
Yeah.
because they really enjoy the culture. But the culture is all about how people feel, how they're treated. They're doing important work. They're rewarded for that. They're working in an environment where the values we talk about are felt.
Mm-hmm.
So the core values, which have been consistent since the company's founding. We survey our employees on a regular basis and ask them, is the culture we're describing the culture you're experiencing? Do you strongly agree with that? Agree, neither agree nor disagree, and so on. And then we're transparent about the results. So people know whether the culture is just something we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
or whether it's something they're in fact experiencing. And then we try to build that culture in to how we interview, how we onboard, our communications, our reward and recognition systems. So we try to make it a core part of the company in a very intentional way.
Yeah. I remember I was told that, at least in the past, every new employee had BWB, Breakfast with Bruce. Does that still happen?
Well, it doesn't still happen because I'm not the CEO.
Right, of course.
And did I literally have breakfast with every single employee that joined the company? No. By the time the company had grown to roughly 3,000 employees, that was no longer the case. But I did regularly do breakfasts with Bruce. Over time, those breakfasts became virtual because we have employees all over the world. And we would intentionally mix it up and have groups that included a preponderance of new employees, but also some tenured employees, and across geographies, across functions, across levels, to really get a good feel for what the company actually is today.
Yeah.
And when I say a preponderance of new employees, if I grab one of my great employees who's been around for 10 or 15 or 20 years and I ask them about the culture, the answer I get may be what the culture is today, but it may also be sort of their thoughts of the culture over time. If I talk to somebody who's only been at the company 3 months and I say, tell me about the culture, they have to be describing the culture now.
Mm-hmm.
And so I use the new employees more as a accurate gauge of where we stand at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Again, I do want to get into history, but what I didn't realize is that Jazz continues to be a hybrid company, even after COVID. You've allowed your employees to work wherever they need to. Why? I mean, when so many companies, especially large companies, are saying, and particularly tech companies, innovative companies, they're telling their employees to come back to the office. Yeah. You have not done that. Why?
Well, I'm not suggesting the strategy we've adopted, which we call remix. I'm not suggesting that is the right strategy for all companies, but for our employees with a well-established culture, with operations in many places, there's no such thing as us all being together, no matter where we tried to make that happen. Right. We've got offices in many locations. But what it's done for us is a couple things. It's allowed our employees to live the life they want to live, better integrating work and family in a meaningful way. It's given us access to the broadest talent pool. We're not saying we were going to hire the best person who happens to live within X miles of a particular office site or is willing to relocate. So it's broadened our talent pool and our diversity as a result of that.
Yeah.
It's a competitive differentiator. Again, I think our employees are more likely to stay with Jazz because 83% of them said before we made this move, this would be their strong preference. It also allows us to hire from other companies when those companies impose their own rules, which don't line up with what their employees want. It's given us better career development opportunities because people can move from one position to another position inside the company without necessarily having to relocate themselves and their families. Yeah. So it's brought a lot of great things to us. And again, we continue to measure that culture. And somewhat to my surprise during COVID, our employee engagement did not go down. It stayed the same or went up.
Yeah.
As did our productivity, which I think a lot of other companies found to be true as well.
Yeah, I did. I learned that your turnover at Jazz is maybe half of what the industry average is. So something to really be proud of.
Yeah,
That's
it varies over time, but it's consistently been, below industry average in terms of voluntary turnover.
right.
Our needs sometimes change. It's not all voluntary. And 0% turnover is not the goal either, right? There is a benefit to, talent evolving over time. But yeah, we want to be the kind of place that employees want to stay with the company for a long time and develop their career and contribute.
Oh, great. So maybe let's get a little bit into some history, your history in particular. You told me early on that your career, your trajectory was profoundly impacted by your time at Alza. And in particular, Alejandro Zaffaroni, who was the founder of Alza. And for our listeners, Alza was a biotech company. I think it was founded in the 1960s. They pioneered controlled release of drugs, right? So that drugs could, be effective over a longer period of time. You worked there for just about a decade, I think, straight out of business school at Stanford, and worked your way up to eventually the chief financial officer role and the chief operating officer role. What was it about Alejandro, about Alex, that so profoundly impacted you? And I think elsewhere, it sounds like there's a lot of Alza alumni out there that went on to do greater things.
Well, Alex gets the credit for building the culture of the company. And over time, that culture, which was well established by the time I arrived at the company in 1991, really became something that profoundly impacted people that worked there. And even though Alza ceased to exist as an independent company in 2001 with its acquisition by Johnson & Johnson, the people that worked there still, though it's been 25 years since then now, still would identify themselves as Alzans, right? Part of the Alza family.
Yeah.
Alex was a technological visionary in terms of drug delivery technology and other technologies that he pursued through other companies he started. But he had a way of treating people and inspiring people and inclusive culture that rubbed off on all of us. And if you've experienced a great culture, in particular, if you can contrast that with anywhere in your career where you've been part of a not so great culture, you want to always be part of that positive culture. And so, as I thought about what to do after J&J bought Alza, what to do next, finding a home with a great culture was high up on my list. In the end, I ended up creating that rather than joining an extant organization. But having had the experience I had at Alza, it was important to me that I work in a culture that made employees feel like it was the best experience of their professional career.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, Johnson & Johnson acquired Alza in 2001. Why did you decide not to stay with J&J at that time? I'm sure that there were, great things about J&J culture as well.
Yeah, and I'm not saying anything negative about J&J. They did offer me an attractive position to stay. But I realized at that point, doing that job well would have entailed spending a lot of my time going back and forth between California and New Jersey. I had 3 young kids at the time. 2 young kids and another one on the way.
So very young.
And that didn't feel like the right thing for me personally, to be, commuting from coast to coast on a regular basis, given my family situation. So I stuck around for a while to help with the integration. I actually then consulted with J&J for quite some time to help make portfolio decisions around the Alza portfolio. But I knew it wasn't where I wanted to be long-term.
Is that also the time I had read that when you were at Alza, pushing and leaning into your career, your wife at the time had taken a step back to raise kids, and you took a couple years. So after Alza was acquired, you took a couple years off. Is that when you, I don't want to say allowed her, but she leaned into her career because you gave her that opportunity as well, which, is a joint decision between the two of you.
Yeah, for sure. She had definitely let her career take a back seat for a while, worked less than full time. And when, I saw myself exiting J&J Alza, we sort of flipped roles and she went, full time. And I don't want to say she put her career first because other things were important to
Of
her
course.
too,
Of course.
but definitely she ramped it up. And that felt like the right thing for our family.
That's great. That's great. You decide that you couldn't find the culture that you were looking for. So a few of you came together and said, hey, let's build something. Let's build Jazz. So let's first talk about the name. There may be listeners that know you, that understand why you chose such a name, but talk about the name and where it came about.
Yeah. So, I was one of the co-founders of Jazz. There were actually 3 of us and a team of 6 of us that ultimately came together as senior management, all of whom were ex-Alza.
Oh,
So when I talk about that culture and what we wanted, the 6 of us all understood that culture. I'm musical. I grew up playing the piano and singing, and music's always been an important part of my life. I wasn't the only one of the founders with music as an important part of our life. And so, together we came up with the name Jazz as a name that, had some energy, had a couple metaphors for our business that I liked. When you think of a jazz musician, you tend to think of somebody who's just a master of their instrument, right? But jazz is always played together. Jazz is always played as a group with lots of give and take. And so, as I thought about assembling a team of people, you want individual experts, but that work well as a team. And that to me is what you get with jazz music. You also think of jazz as improvisational. We would call it innovation in business, not improvisation.
Right.
But why can jazz musicians get up on stage and play together if they're making it up as they go along? Well, there's a shared understanding of the structure of the music that underlies that. And in our industry, we want innovation, but we need to innovate on top of the structure. We work in a highly regulated industry for good reason. And so there are things you want to innovate, and you have to, pay attention to a lot of things that you got to get right.
Yeah.
And so jazz fit that as well. It also gave us the chance to do some playful things, name all our conference rooms after jazz clubs or great jazz musicians. So it gave us a nice theme to work with as well.
Oh, that's great. That's super fun. So when you guys came together, you didn't actually have a compound. Am I right that it took almost 2 years to find Orphan Medical, which was your first acquisition?
Yeah, so we did decide to start the company before we had a compound, a patent, a technology, a disease focus, right? We said, let's come together, raise capital, and pursue a business that sort of we understood had built on our knowledge from Alza. It was a couple years before we acquired our first commercial product, which was the Orphan Medical transaction in 2005. But we had started some R&D programs along the way, licensed in from others.
Am I correct that the founding round was $150+ million that you were able to raise?
Yeah, it was actually $250 million, which was an unusually large transaction back in 2004.
Yeah.
It's been done since, but at the time it was
that's a lot back then.
Something very unusual. We had actually done a seed round of $15 million as our Series A, which was really to give us money to turn the lights on, start hiring a team. But then we, within a year, completed the Series B, which was the $250 million round.
Yeah. It's really a testament to the team that you brought together and the belief that you could recreate the magic of Alza again, I would imagine.
Yeah, there were a couple of things about that financing. As you mentioned, the fact that we were a team that had proven we could work together, I think was an advantage, as opposed to cobbling together people who were excellent in their own right, but hadn't yet demonstrated they could work together.
Yeah.
But the other thing was, we as a management team, together with our investors in that B round, thought that raising a lot of capital that was committed would allow us to pursue a portfolio strategy a little bit earlier in terms of both development programs and commercial assets, not to make us dependent on, one singular program. And, not all companies go that direction, but we thought that would be a good way to start, particularly if we wanted to build a sizable organization.
So you acquired Orphan Medical, which had the Xyrem compound, which is what Jazz is primarily known for. It's a compound that is used in patients that have narcolepsy. And that still is, that compound or the base of that compound is still very important today. But it wasn't an easy drug. There was definitely some safety issues, highly regulatory environment. You had to put a risk management program around it. A lot of people would look at that company, that compound, and say, no thanks. What was it about the more complicated commercial organization that was required that was attractive to you?
Yeah. So to be fair, the product had been launched. The risk, what today would be called a REMS, Risk Evaluation and Mitigation System. At the time, it was called a risk map. This goes back a long way. Was already in place. And you're right, it added some complexity. But what we saw was a very serious disease. Narcolepsy was underdiagnosed, undertreated, highly disabling. And this drug really worked, meaning it made a huge difference in the lives of these narcolepsy patients.
Yeah.
And when a drug really, really works, then I think you can work your way through the complexity of, okay, we need a special way to distribute it that keeps it safe. This is a drug that could be abused. So you wanted to limit abuse, misuse, and diversion of the drug. So it was worth it because the payoff to patients was really spectacular. And we started out with just one indication indicated for the treatment of cataplexy and narcolepsy, ultimately added another indication with EDS, ultimately added a pediatric indication, ultimately developed a better version of the drug that's safer
a lower
in
sodium
terms of
version.
sodium content in Xywav, added another indication to Xywav and idiopathic hypersomnia. So, we did acquire the initial commercial product, but we definitely did a lot of additional work over a long period of time to continue finding better ways to help patients with that underlying compound oxybate.
Yeah. So at this point, I believe it's 2007, and you decide to go public. Interestingly enough, it was not an easy IPO. I think if you had to, Xyrem was going well, but you had a second drug. What is it?
Luvox CR.
Yeah, Luvox CR. That was questionable, I think, from analysts. And you had to price down the IPO twice. And ultimately, but it was a successful IPO. You got it done.
Well, successful IPO in that we raised the capital we needed to continue making progress for the company. I've never looked at financings as a victory. Financings are giving you the fuel you need to create value. The financing itself isn't creating value. It's giving you capital to invest in and hopefully create value through those investments.
Yeah.
IPO windows open and they close. It pretty much slammed on us as we ran through it on the way down.
Right.
But yeah, it did give us the capital to continue building the company.
That's great. And do you feel as though going public changed either the culture or how people spent their time or your role in any way, shape, or form? What's the downsides of going public?
Well, let me start with we went public for a reason. And I think access to public capital, liquidity for investors and employees through stock compensation, all are positive. So I don't want to make it sound like being a public company is a bad thing.
Right.
But there are things that come along with being a public company in terms of obligations and costs. And this odd thing that people think they know what the company is worth every second of every day that the stock trades. And, sometimes that stock going up or down has a lot more to do with what's going on in the world or what's going on in the industry than what's going on in your company. And so trying to make sure that we as a management team and all of our employees were focused on what we needed to do to improve the lives of patients and their families rather than to try to make the stock go up by a certain amount on a certain day. I would tell my employees that I would often go days without checking our stock price, which was true.
That is good.
Now, I always believed if it moved enough, somebody was going to tell me, but
one way or another.
But I didn't want to be one of those CEOs who, at the bottom of their computer screen has a ticker going across with the moment-to-moment changes in stock price. And certainly when the company faced real financial headwinds and was in trouble, and we were in trouble in 2008, 2009.
Yeah.
It's a little harder to maintain morale when people feel like there's an external,
barometer
metric
or measurement
moving every day.
Yeah.
So again, being very clear on what we were trying to accomplish and why, and keeping the company focused on that rather than the stock price, at least in the short term, became imperative.
So let's talk a little bit about 0809, because it does feel as though this was a pivotal moment for the company because, it almost was the end of Jazz. So I'm going to list off what the current situation was and let's go from there. So we talked about Xyrem going well, Luvox CR, which was the drug for obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety, was not going very well. You had a $120 million senior term loan with Lehman Brothers at a 15% interest rate. You were burning through lots of cash. You failed to make an interest payment on that debt. And I think you had $15 to $17 million left in the bank. Oh, and your stock price was 53 cents. So
other than that, though,
things were going great. No, so obviously this was an exceptionally difficult period of time. The one thing before we talk about the decisions that were made, I meant to ask you, you were executive chair for the first 6 years of Jazz.
Yeah.
You were not the CEO.
Correct.
What was the reason for that? How did you think about the split roles between exec chair and CEO?
Well, again, it was a group of us that had worked together before, coming back together to create this company. Sam Sachs, who was our founding CEO, and I had worked together closely at Alza for years. And we both wanted to do this. I agreed to take the executive chair role. He took the CEO role. In part at the time, I had not committed to be working 100% time for the company at the beginning. That changed quickly.
Yeah, right.
It went from 50% time to 75% time to 80% time to 90% time to 100% time. And then they stopped counting after that, but it went past that.
Right, I'm sure.
But, we worked together. So as executive chairman, I was part of the executive team. The CEO reported to me. We were both on the board. Mm-hmm. So it worked for us. Yeah. I'm not saying it's a structure that would work for everyone, but we knew it would work because we had worked together closely before.
That's great.
In terms of the situation you described in 2008, 2009, I'll add to your pile of woes there.
Okay. So it gets even better.
That was the primary supplier of that debt facility itself went bankrupt.
Right.
Which actually turned out to be relevant because when we wanted to negotiate, as most companies would if they're in default on their debt, a way to get out. Can I skip a couple quarters of interest and pay you back later? Can I pay you at a default rate? Can we trade some equity for the debt? All the things you would normally do. There was essentially no one at the other end of the phone when we called to have those negotiations. Yeah. They were in workout themselves. Which was a really unusual situation. You mentioned that we failed to make an interest payment on the debt, which is true. We actually chose not to make that interest payment.
Yeah.
We had an ongoing clinical trial. It was a really tough decision for us to figure out whether to stop that clinical trial, in which case we would have had the cash to make that interest payment, or to hang on to the cash, miss the interest payment, continue the clinical trial. And I felt like we had an obligation to those patients and investigators, and we were excited to get the results. So we knew that put us in default on the debt, and that meant the lenders had some choices, including pushing us into bankruptcy. We worked with some really smart advisors who said they won't do that. They're going to threaten to do that, but they won't do that because that'll be worse for them than letting the company continue on its path toward profitability, which we were on at that time. We did have to cut our burn very significantly. We reduced headcount by about 50%. Again, something almost everybody in our industry has been through at least once or more in their career.
Yeah.
And those were hard decisions, but it was really, we need to get to a point where we are not dependent on the capital markets, which were closed for everybody at that time,
right,
during the financial meltdown. We need to get to a point where we're not dependent on the capital markets for the money to execute on our plans. So we scaled back R&D to almost nothing.
Yeah, you halted
and
3
continued
clinical
a path
programs.
of growing revenues that we knew would put us in a profitable situation, in 6 or 7 months, which is what happened.
I think I read that you had said that during that period of time, and ultimately you did become CEO, following the great financial crisis. But during that period of time, you became the leader that you wanted to be. What did you mean by that?
I think leaders who go through really tough times learn a lot about themselves as well as the organization. Working through that really difficult period of time, I was reminded of why I'm excited to be in the business we're in. And I worried a lot about investors losing money. And, I felt an obligation to the people who had invested behind us, whether that was as a private company or a public company. I worried about, was I letting people down if they, lost money on their investment? And I worried a lot about our employees, that we were separating from their jobs during a really tough period to find new work, given that the financial meltdown was impacting everyone, not just us. But ultimately, what got me fired up and energized to bang my head against the wall another day, trying to work our way out of this mess, was realizing that patients were depending on us. Both with the commercial product where, again, given the complexity we talked about a little earlier in this conversation of the distribution system and the costs associated with it, it wasn't 100% clear to me that if we went under, somebody else would pick that up.
Yeah.
And so I thought there are real patients out there who are depending on us, to keep this medicine available. And we obviously had hopes of bringing other medications to market as well. And so, recommitting to the mission of the company or the core purpose of the company, really that we're in it for the patients, was highly motivating. And then it became much easier for me to rally the rest of the company and the rest of the team around the importance of the work we were doing.
Yeah. So it really reinforced the culture.
Interestingly, during those really tough times, we talked about turnover a little bit earlier in the conversation. Turnover went to essentially zero. Nobody left, even though they all had good reason to consider leaving during that time, because they really wanted to see the company fulfill its obligations and continue on.
Yeah.
We were fortunate then as we started succeeding and, financially we were in stronger shape. We were able to raise more capital. We were able to start expanding some of what we did. We were able to bring back, many of the people that had left the organization. And again, real testament to the culture of the company, that people that had been involuntarily separated from the company wanted to come back.
Yeah.
And I think says a lot about how we treated them during that tough time when we were telling them they were out of a job. We spent a lot of time communicating directly with them, making sure they understood they were still just as talented as they were the day before. This was not about them. This was about the company. And we were transparent. Here's the same presentation we gave to our board of directors that shows you what what kind of shape we're in and why we're making the choices that we're making.
Yeah. I think if there are some listeners that might say, hey, well, you know what? The global financial crisis, that's in the past. That's never going to happen again. Why do I need to learn about this? Why do I need to learn about this sort of decision making? What would you say to some leaders as they think about how they should operate during certain crises on a go-forward basis? What's the right balance of tough decision making, but perhaps maybe with some empathy?
Well, I don't want to compare all situations as being identical, but crisis in general demands certain things of leaders. More communication, right, in a period of uncertainty, whether that uncertainty is being felt by investors, by employees, by patients, by investigators, right? It's probably, even though the communication may be hard, you probably need to do more, not less communication. And you've got to make sure people can trust you, right? You've got to have integrity. The information's got to be accurate. You can't, you can't sugarcoat it. You got to tell it like it is. And, during that period where our stock traded down below $1, we weren't promising our investors we would absolutely positively, get the stock to, it's closer to 200 now, but
Yeah.
We didn't promise that to anyone. We talked about what we were doing in the short term to try to right the ship and how we thought that could succeed. We were very transparent with the people that put in new capital, which we needed at that point, about where the company stood and what decisions we were making. And again, we went back to the purpose of the company and what motivated employees to want to be part of the organization in the first place, in terms of the difference we could make for patients and their families.
Yeah.
So, again, you don't want to go through these things, whether it's, a financial crisis, whether it's a clinical trial failure, whether it's a drug coming off the market, whether it's new competition, whether it's COVID, right? There are things that come up that you have to deal with as a leader. And, one of my lessons learned, I think, during that period was, you got to have a plan B, probably a plan C and a plan D. And I felt like one of our failures as a team at the time is we weren't sure we had a path to survive. And I often say to CEOs, it's okay to bet the company. You can say to your board and your investors, let's bet the company on this decision, but you ought to know you're betting the company. And I feel like we sort of bet the company during that period on a successful launch of Luvox CR, continued availability of capital. And when those things didn't go the way we wanted, we came very close to not surviving. And had we said that to the board, we're all in on this. If it doesn't work, we're out of business. That's one thing. But to have gone through that period without making that conscious decision, we were betting the company, probably was a mistake.
Interesting.
Although when we all write those risk factor sections of our, 10K,
SEC filings,
our public disclosure, it always feels like we list every risk we can think of. Lehman going bankrupt was not on my bingo card.
No, I don't think that was on anyone's.
I really hadn't predicted that one.
No, for sure. I think everybody in finance remembers that day, that Monday morning when they were just gone. And as you said, nobody was there to pick up the phone on the other side. So thankfully, as you talked about, things spiral down, but then they can spiral back up. And that's the great optimism of what is, what makes companies great and what can definitely work out. As you came out of that and you went into 2000, maybe the 2010, 2011 timeframe, the next 5 years was very much an expansion year for you. Much more acquisitions, bringing on new product lines, going international. So can you talk about that strategy and the conversations that you had with the board, among your senior management team, to say, hey, we don't want to be just a Xyrem single product company. How do we go through this strategy and how do we maintain the culture? How do we, go about that? So can you talk about the strategic vision behind that period of time?
Yeah, I mean, we had always had the vision from the time of the initial large financing. it had always been our goal to build a significant company. And certainly the investors that committed that capital, if you think about putting $250 million of capital to work and thinking you're going to earn a multiple on that, the company had to grow to realize that vision. And so that was not a new ambition. That had always been our ambition. When we found ourselves in stronger financial position, we were able to make some acquisitions, do some mergers, diversify the business a little bit, which was important. Even so, after we added other products to the commercial portfolio, expanded our R&D commitment, we still found ourselves 75% dependent on one product.
Yeah.
That's not an unusual thing in our industry. Most successful companies, big or small, got successful because at some point they had a product that really, was a significant product. And we found ourselves in that situation. And, we took all the strategic steps we could think of so that when we ultimately did not have that product as a major source of revenue, we'd still have a vibrant company. Over time, as we brought out Xywav as the new product, as we completed the GW acquisition, which brought us a large and growing epilepsy product, as we expanded in oncology, an area we'd gotten into in 2012, and ultimately made that $1 billion plus business, the company became much more stable and much less dependent on just that one original product.
Yeah. Again, I'm always curious because we did talk a lot about culture and people and employees and that connection. As you get bigger, and you guys got significantly bigger over that 5-6 year period, how do you maintain the culture, especially when you're dealing with international employees that, it's really a different culture, not to overuse the word. How do you maintain it?
There are differences in culture around the world for sure. But there's a lot of commonality too. And again, that purpose-driven company, right? Really being all about what we're doing for patients and having that be what motivates us all. Having core values that are consistent across geographies, across functions, I think is important. But individual practices can vary. That's okay. I think they're a little bit different between Philadelphia and Palo Alto too, but
that's right.
And once the culture is strong and it's consistent, it becomes hard to change.
Yeah.
And if your culture is great, that's a source of resilience and strength. If your culture is bad, it makes it hard to change the bad culture. But once it's really built in, you can feel it as a new employee. When you join the organization and there are another, 2,500 or 3,000 employees who are all behaving a certain way, responding in a certain way to situations, you pick up on that, right? It's hard to be the 3,001st employee and dramatically change the culture.
That's right.
Right? It
becomes
something that's more predictable.
Yeah.
And then, as I've said many times, I do think you can measure culture. And the way you keep it strong is you ask employees for feedback about what the culture is and is it what we want it to be. When I allowed in our surveys free text response, so in addition to the, strongly agree to strongly disagree, there were places where employees could write in comments. One of my favorite comments, and we got it almost every year from at least one employee, was, "I love the culture and I'm afraid it's going to change." And the reason that's my favorite comment is it tells me two things. It tells me they still think the culture is good, which is what we're aiming for, but it also says they care about it.
Yeah.
When an employee says, "I'm afraid the culture is going to change," they're telling you, "I want it to stay the way it is." And that means they're going to be engaged in keeping it that way. And so, again, by measuring, by being transparent with the data, reflecting back to employees, here's what you told us, here's what you said is going well, we'll keep doing that. Here's what you said isn't going well, we'll make some changes to that. And then we'll remeasure. Did the changes we make solve the problem? Yes or no?
Yeah.
So employees can always tell you where you are. You've got to want to hear it.
That's right.
We do anonymous surveys periodically so that people will be completely honest with us. I do tell employees, anonymous is not my favorite way to get feedback. I'd rather know who it's coming from so I can follow up and ask questions and learn more. But making sure people know that their voice will be heard.
Yeah.
In the transparent share out of the results, in addition to giving the data, we would highlight employee comments. And even though most of them were positive,
every now and then, of course,
we'd share an equal number of negative comments just so employees would know that if they were critical, we were seeing those comments and we were hearing that.
That's great. And remind me, how many times do you do this survey per year? Is it once or twice?
So it's changed over time. The default was, an annual survey. We've actually gone to pulse surveys a little more frequently, with some of those pulse surveys not necessarily being full company surveys. They might be targeted to a different, a specific part of the company, to learn a little bit more. But every now and then we still do a full company survey.
I think that's great. It feels like, I'm sure employees feel like they have a voice when they're being asked their opinions, which is great.
But again, if you're going to do this as a company, and I recommend people do this, you've got to make sure people feel heard or they will stop giving you the feedback.
Right.
So if you ask people to tell you what's going right and is going wrong, and then you don't do anything about it, they will stop telling you.
That's right. Yeah, they have to feel like they're part of the change and part of the continuous improvement of the company.
Yeah.
Great. So maybe we can fast forward to 2021. We'll talk about another acquisition that was in many ways a defining acquisition of Jazz, and that is GW Pharmaceuticals. So GW was a company that had a cannabis-based product for epilepsy in particular. And so it was an expensive deal. So maybe I'll give you another list of some of the concerns. $7.2 billion. At the time, your market cap was $9 to $10 billion. So pretty expensive. It was a 50% premium to GW's stock price. It was significantly dilutive for you. You had to take on significant debt and leverage. The criticisms was, well, this is CBD, so the science isn't really that deep. There's not really durability to how long this compound can continue to contribute to the franchise. This was a defensive move, not an offensive move, because your main product, Xyrem, was coming off patent later on, in a couple 2 to 3 years, I think. And on top of that, GW had a very expensive price for this compound, $32,500 for the drug. So analysts were not happy. Were you surprised by the criticism that you received from Wall Street? And why did you feel strongly about this deal in particular?
Well, let's go back to why we're in business. We loved the product. The product really helps these patients with childhood onset seizure disorders, these rare disorders. Let's start with, you take a serious disease and you have a drug that really works. Now, it's often used in polypharmacy, so I don't want to say it's the singular treatment, but
Sure.
Often combined with other treatments to get a good effect. It had been a very successful launch for GW. The product was continuing to grow. We said it would be a blockbuster product. It is a blockbuster product now and continuing to grow. We believed it would be would have long durability. And we said that. You can't necessarily prove that on the day you do the deal. The IP strategy was still playing out in terms of new patents being issued, and then, the inevitable litigation with ANDA ANDA filers. But, we've publicly said those settlements with all the ANDA filers go out to the very late 2030s,
Yeah.
which is significantly longer than people initially gave us credit for. It also establishes us in an area where we think there's additional opportunity to bring new therapies to market. So we think we can build a pipeline behind Epidiolex as a product. So stock market reaction on the day you announce a deal is not the only measure of success. Ultimately, does it contribute to your strategy? And, as a company now that has a multi-billion-dollar sleep business and a north of $1 billion epilepsy business and a north of $1 billion oncology business, we feel the company is in stronger position to execute on our strategy. So we love the deal. It took a little while for that criticism to die out. And a lot of people now say it was a really smart deal with the benefit of the information they have now that they didn't have at that time.
Yeah.
But I'll go back, you started by describing it as a cannabis-derived drug, which it is. Drugs come from all sorts of interesting places. And what ultimately matters to me is what it does for the patient. Drugs come from sea snails and tree bark and mare urine. And, drugs can come from lots of places.
Yeah.
The question is, does it make a difference for those patients in a way that's meaningful relative to their disease and relative to other current therapies and future therapies? And to us, Epidiolex checked all those boxes.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it does seem, as you said, now it's on a greater than $1 billion run rate. So it...
the other thing I'll say is, like Jazz, GW had been around for about 20 years at that time, had a very strong culture. The people at GW love their culture.
Of course.
Jazz had essentially started almost as a commercial company and sort of started working back through development to earlier and earlier development. GW kind of went the other way. They started with earlier development and worked their way up through late development and commercial. And when we put the two organizations together and really tried to keep the best of both, Jazz and GW, we ended up with capabilities that would have taken us a number of years to build, particularly in the earlier R&D. Skills that we then applied not just to Epidiolex and epilepsies, but to the rest of our pipeline as well. So again, it was primarily about the lead product, but it wasn't only about the lead product.
Right. So it's good to see some R&D synergies as well. Yeah. That's great. You recently announced a retirement. You are no longer CEO of Jazz. Talk about what went into that decision. 20 plus years is a great run, so I'm not going to question the timeline, but, how do you make decisions like that? Because in many ways, Bruce Cozad is synonymous with Jazz Pharmaceuticals. So the company is certainly entering a new period.
Yeah, so it wasn't a decision I made lightly. I've been answering that question for years, how long are you going to do this? And my answer for years had been the same, which is, I don't know. I love my job. I can't imagine stepping out of this job, at least until I'm an empty nester, because until I'm an empty nester, I'm tied to a school calendar and, I don't have freedom to do a lot of other things. Once I'm an empty nester, I'll have more choice space.
Yeah.
So interestingly for me, the day our youngest graduated from high school, I woke up that morning and thought, I think it's time.
Really?
Which surprised me. I had always thought when I hit that moment of being an empty nester, I would say, oh, I'm going to do it for another 3 to 5 years or something. But it just felt to me like maybe it was time. I slept on that decision for June, July, August, September, and October. I call that a live with. You're living with your decision. You haven't communicated it to anyone, but you're imagining that you've made the decision and you're trying to figure out, am I still comfortable with that decision? And really every day for all those months, I thought, yeah, I think this is the right time. I then told the board, we then publicly disclosed a succession process. I knew we had a great internal successor. That didn't mean that was the only possible choice, but that made me feel more confident too that the company would be in good hands. I had a great board and a great board committee that really oversaw a very thoughtful process of thinking about what the next chapter of Jazz would look like and therefore what the right type of leader would be. And then was able to look at external candidates and internal candidates both to fashion the best choice. But through the executive chair and the CEO roles, I've been leading the organization for 22 and a half years. That is a long time.
Yeah.
I like to tell people 3 things have to be true for you to lead a company for that long. Number 1, the company has to survive that long, which doesn't always happen in our industry. Number 2, you have to still be the right leader for the company for a long time, which given the companies evolve isn't always the case. And number 3, you probably had to start when you were young to get to 22 and a half years. And I had started the company when I was 39. So that checked out too. But I felt like it was the right time to hand over leadership to someone new, and Renee's doing a fantastic job.
That's great. And by the way, I don't like calling it empty nesting. I like calling it being a free bird. So now you're.
I like that.
Yeah,
I like that.
So it's still with a bird reference, but now more of a free bird. So you remain chairman of the board, and while I appreciate that you can't say how long you'll be on the board, how do you think about the advantages and disadvantages of kind of the founder, the CEO for so long, staying on the board?
Well, let me start with, there are lots of examples of founder, longtime leaders who've remained engaged with companies in a way that's helpful to the company. There are also lots of examples of founder, longtime leaders who have not been helpful to the company by staying involved. And there are, certainly some well-publicized cases where I think it has not been to the benefit of the organization or to the new leader, not fair to the new leader, to have an old leader looking over your shoulder, questioning everything you're doing. It was my belief and the board's belief that Renee and I could handle that succession process well together, and that I'd be a help, not a hindrance. The board gets to keep evaluating that, by the way. There's no signed agreement that says I have to be chairman for some period of time. I'm elected to the board like other board members every couple of years. Yeah. So, whether I'm up for re-election is not solely my decision. It's the board's decision. But I care a lot about the company. I care a lot about the culture. I care a lot about our mission. I think I still have things to add, even as not an operating executive, but at the strategic governance level, along with talented board members that I work with. I don't think there's only one right answer to how to do that for other companies. I think if you're going to keep the old CEO around, that CEO has to realize the company has a new leader, and that new leader needs to be empowered and needs to lead in her or his way. And you got to back them up on the decisions they want to make, rather than say, well, I would do it differently.
Right.
So
that's not valuable for sure.
Yeah.
As you think about this next chapter of your career, how are you spending your time? I know you're involved in philanthropy.
Yeah.
You've shown interest in teaching. So how would you like to see this next chapter of your life?
Well, I said when I retired, I would take a year to figure that out. So I don't claim, I'm not through a year yet, so I don't claim to have all the answers yet. I've always done nonprofit work. It motivates me. The 2 organizations I've been most deeply involved with in the past number of years have been the Nueva School, a school that all 5 of our kids attended for varying lengths of time, and SF Jazz, probably not a surprise given the name of the company that I am involved with, a jazz organization, a great one.
Yeah.
I'm also involved at Stanford University in a number of different ways and have been for many years. You mentioned teaching. I love being a guest lecturer on things that I care about, where I think I have something to say.
Mhm.
I've done that for years. I will continue to do that. I like CEO mentoring. So I've done that for years too.
Yeah.
I think I've learned some things along the way, some things because I did them right, some things because I did them wrong, that can benefit other people. And I love sharing that in a way that helps others be the best leaders they can be.
Yeah.
More time with the kids, more time with family than I was able to devote as a full-time CEO. But I'll figure some of it out as I go.
That's great. As you sit here today and you reflect on your, 20, 25 years almost at Jazz, what are you most proud of?
So I'm most proud of the impact we've had on patients and the opportunity to have employees, past as well as present, who really loved or love working at Jazz Pharmaceuticals, that find that a fulfilling, rewarding, motivating career stop. We always say we want to be the best place you've ever worked, and I think for a lot of employees that has proven to be true. So I'm very proud of that.
Yeah.
I'm also proud that we've generated a lot of great leaders over the 20 some years of the company now who've gone on to be leaders elsewhere. So there are about 20 folks who worked at Jazz at some point in their career who've been CEOs somewhere else.
Wow.
During all those years I stayed in the job, they couldn't become CEO of Jazz, so they went off to be CEO somewhere else. And that's been true of other functions too. People who've gone on to be CFOs elsewhere, general counsels elsewhere, heads of commercial elsewhere, heads of R&D elsewhere, that we've hopefully given them a chance to further their career. And then I always hope when they go out to either create their own organization or join another organization, I always hope they bring a little bit of Jazz with them.
Yeah.
A little bit of the way we think about culture. We've developed a lot of folks who went on to be chief people officers elsewhere too. I think because they have something to say about culture and they've learned some things at Jazz that are certainly transportable to other organizations.
Well, I can tell you that from the people that I talked to, they really talked about how you defined the culture at Jazz. You were a connector. You connected people at all levels, from, a part-time executive administrator, and admin to, to patients, to your senior executives. You created a culture where people really felt mission-oriented, but also felt connected to everybody else in the organization. So it is something that you should absolutely be proud of.
I like to think I had a uniquely strong relationship with my employees. There was two ways. So hopefully they would say good things about my leadership, but it was also me saying great things about them.
Yeah.
And the chance to connect with employees, again, at all levels, in all geographies, in all functions, was one of the most rewarding parts of my job.
Yeah. Well, Bruce, congratulations on an exceptional career, on founding an exceptional company. I can't thank you enough for spending time with me and helping to share your wisdom, your hard-earned wisdom, with some business bruises probably on your back. But thank you for sharing that with us. Yeah. And I'm sure my audience will really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for doing your homework. I could tell by some of your tough questions, you had really done your homework. But
I try.
I love the chance to share learnings and I hope that people do find this helpful.
Thank you again, Bruce. I hope you have a wonderful weekend and we'll be in touch.
Thanks.